In a war where every misstep could cost a life, no one in the platoon imagined that their biggest problem would come from a completely destroyed village, seemingly empty after hours of heavy bombardment. It was just another point on the map, just another devastated place that everyone wanted to cross quickly to stay alive. But that day, something different happened, and it began precisely when the team's dog, a German shepherd trained to sniff out mines and ambushes, simply froze amidst the rubble. Anne stared at a house that should already have been in total ruins. The soldiers called out, pulled on the leash, shouted, but nothing. The puppy didn't respond, only breathed deeply and kept its eyes fixed on the fallen door. The commander tried to ignore it, thinking the animal was frightened by the sound of gunfire still echoing in the distance. But then, the dog did something no one expected. It moved forward on its own, as if pulled by an instinct that even the most experienced trainers couldn't explain. It entered the destroyed house slowly, disappearing into the dust and smoke. And that's when the atmosphere truly changed. The silence outside was so strange that even the most nervous soldier realized something was wrong. It wasn't normal, it wasn't routine behavior. The dog always came back quickly, always gave a signal. But this time, nothing. 5 seconds. 10. 30. 1 minute. The entire platoon stood still, staring at the dark entrance of that house as if expecting something to come out of there, and not necessarily something good. One of the soldiers even said the dog might have fallen into a hole or found hidden enemies. Another suggested forgetting about it and continuing the mission. But nobody could turn their backs. When the animal finally appeared, staggering, covered in dust, its fur full of crumbs from the walls and its eyes wide, the platoon thought it had found a body or some kind of trap. But no, what it was carrying in its teeth made the commander freeze instantly. It wasn't food, it wasn't a piece of wood, it wasn't anything ordinary. It was something metallic, heavy, with markings and symbols that none of them had seen before, but which clearly shouldn't be there in the middle of a destroyed house. And at that moment, without anyone quite understanding, it became clear that the object wasn't just a random find. It was a warning, an alert, a secret that shouldn't have been found by anyone, much less a dog. And it's precisely here that the story gets serious, because what this German shepherd brought out of that house would turn the whole operation upside down, expose an enemy plan, and place the platoon at the center of a discovery that would change the course of the war. Now tell me something. Can you imagine what a dog might find in the most destroyed place in the whole village? And more importantly, why was it hidden there? What do you think a dog might have found in a completely destroyed house in the midst of war? Before continuing the story, let's leave the like with subscribe to the channel and comment below. What city are you watching from? This greatly helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss any part of this story full of twists and turns. The platoon advanced through the destroyed village as if traversing a ghost territory. Nothing moved except the smoke billowing from the fallen rooftops. The trees were broken in half, the ground riddled with fresh craters and scattered pieces of brick, as if they had exploded seconds before. Anyone passing by could swear the enemy had just retreated, but for the American soldiers, this meant only one thing: hidden danger. Every village that was too quiet had some trap waiting to catch someone off guard. Commander Blake walked ahead, crumpled map in hand, his gaze fixed on the remains of the houses. He knew the area had been bombed the previous night, but the platoon's radio had failed hours earlier. They didn't know if the enemy had fled, if they were hiding, or if they were preparing a surprise attack. It was like entering a dark room without knowing where the floor was. And to make matters worse, the unit's dog, Rocky, the German shepherd trained to sniff out mines, explosives, and hidden soldiers, had been restless since early morning. Rocky usually walked beside Lewis, the soldier responsible for him, always alert, always confident, always silent when nothing was wrong. But that day he pulled on the leash, sniffed the air more intensely, stopped suddenly and stared at random places, as if he were listening to sounds that no human being could hear. Lewis tried to calm him down several times, stroking the animal's neck, but Rocky seemed to be on another level of concentration, as if he were hunting something that only he knew what it was. When they arrived in the center of the village, they saw the house destroyed, or what was left of it. The building was so dilapidated that it looked as if half of it had been torn away by hand. The door was fallen, the windows broken, the side wall open like an exposed wound. It was the kind of place any soldier would avoid entering without reason. Everything there threatened to collapse. And worse, houses like that were perfect for hiding enemies, weapons, or mines. Blake ordered everyone to quickly move through the street and head towards the other side of the village. The focus of that mission was to reach a higher observation point where they could try to re-establish communication with command. They didn't have time to search through unpredictable ruins. At least that's what everyone believed, until Rocky stopped walking altogether. The German shepherd froze in front of the destroyed house as if his paws were glued to the ground. Lewis tugged at the leash once. Nothing. He tugged again. Rocky didn't even blink. He just stared at that dark entrance like someone who sees something too dangerous to ignore. "Come on, Rocky. Let's go," Lewis murmured, trying to keep his voice steady even though his stomach felt tight. Rocky was disobeying. The commander approached, annoyed by the interruption. "What's going on here?" Blake asked. "He doesn't want to leave, sir. It seems he's trying to warn you about something," Lewis replied. Blake looked at the house. It was a black hole, completely silent, utterly unstable. No one had any interest in going in there. For all intents and purposes, it was just rubble. But the commander knew Rocky. That dog never missed. Signals, never gave silly warnings, and never ever braked unnecessarily. It was at that moment that the atmosphere changed. A cold wind swept through the street as if announcing something. The soldiers began to look around, more tense, more alert, as if they had just entered invisible territory. Blake approached the entrance slowly, stepping carefully so as not to further disturb what was already fragile. He wanted to understand why the dog was so fixated on that spot. But before any decision could be made, Rocky took the initiative. Without any warning, he shot into the destroyed house. Lewis yelled. The commander cursed. The soldiers instinctively raised their weapons, but it was too late. The dog disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as if swallowed by the wreckage. "That wasn't good," murmured Private Evans, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. "He never does that. Never," said Lewis, pacing nervously. Blake knew they needed to decide quickly. If Rocky had fallen into a hole, they would have to rescue him. If he had encountered enemies, they were all exposed. And if he had smelled explosives, well, nobody wanted to think about that possibility. "Stay alert. Weapons at the ready. No one enters until we hear a signal," ordered the commander. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. It wasn't the silence of an empty village. It was the silence of something happening inside, the kind of silence that makes even the bravest person doubt whether they should be there. Seconds that felt like minutes. Minutes that felt like hours. A crack came from inside the house. Then another. Then the sound of something being dragged. The soldiers exchanged tense glances. No one moved. No one could breathe properly. Then came the barking. But it wasn't just any bark. It was a short, tense, deep bark, an alert bark. The bark Rocky only used when he found something important. Blake froze. He knew that bark. He knew exactly what it meant. Rocky had found something. Whatever it was, it wasn't good. The commander beckoned Lewis with a quick gesture. "Get ready. We're going in," he said, his jaw clenched. And so, with racing hearts and the clear feeling that they were about to discover something that shouldn't be found, the platoon moved towards the destroyed house, without imagining that this step would mark the beginning of a turning point capable of shaking up the entire military operation in the region. The group advanced to the entrance of the ruined house with slow, controlled steps, like those treading on thin ice. Each soldier knew that this type of ruin was treacherous. One wrong move, and everything could collapse. Commander Blake raised his clenched fist, a sign of absolute silence. The air was already heavy with the smell of gunpowder, dust, and burnt wood. The soldiers' breaths were short, tense, heavy with fear and adrenaline. Inside, Rocky had stopped barking, which made everything even worse. A trained military dog didn't interrupt an alert without reason. Either he was expecting something, or he was facing something that demanded silence, and that made Lewis's heart race. He gripped the rifle so tightly that his fingers began to ache under his gloves. "Rocky," he whispered, almost begging for an answer. Nothing. Blake signaled for 3 soldiers to position themselves beside the entrance, one for cover, one to advance, and another to watch for possible external movements. They knew that any noise could give away their position to enemies hiding nearby. Silence was their worst enemy at that moment, and also their greatest warning. The interior of the house resembled a dark tunnel. The front had almost completely collapsed, creating piles of rubble that looked like crushed wall shells. The roof was partially down, with leaning beams miraculously holding up the weight. Dust fell in small clouds with every slight vibration. Each step was calculated as if stepping into an invisible minefield. Blake entered first, crouching, sliding between the remaining walls. A beam of light shone through a crack, illuminating particles of dust suspended in the air. He raised the flashlight attached to his rifle and scanned the space slowly. The place was even more destroyed than it appeared from the outside. There were broken furniture, pieces of burnt clothing, torn photographs soiled with dirt, and an overturned chair beside a small puddle of murky water. The war had ripped everything from that house. Even the silence seemed too heavy. Lewis came in right behind him, calling out to Rocky in a low voice. "Rocky, kid, give us a sign." That's when they heard something. A slight dragging sound. Lewis froze. "Something moved over there," Evans murmured. Blake raised his fist, asking for focus. The flashlight passed through the back of the house, where the walls were more intact, but still full of deep cracks. Through an opening that looked like it had been ripped off by a projectile. Fragments of a room could be seen, a fallen wardrobe, a partially burned bed, and marks on the floor as if someone had tried to drag something large. Rocky was there. The dog stood right in the center of the room, its body tense, ears perked forward, and eyes fixed on something the platoon couldn't yet see. It was completely alert, as if it had found not just an object, but a threat. Its raised fur betrayed this. Lewis felt a chill down his spine. What did he see? Evans whispered. Blake kept the gun. Pointed in the direction the dog was looking. Lewis, moved slowly. See what Rocky is indicating. Lewis took a deep breath and took 3 controlled steps, dodging pieces of fallen beam. Each crack of the wood sounded like an explosion. When he got close enough, he could see what Rocky was staring at, and that made his legs go weak. In the corner of the room, covered in debris, there was a body, an enemy soldier, an officer by the uniform, partially buried under fragments of wall. His face was smeared with dust and dried blood. His right hand still clutched something tightly against his chest, as if he had tried to protect it until the very last second. Lewis swallowed hard. "Sir, there's a dead enemy here, and he's holding something." Blake approached slowly, keeping his weapon at the ready. Although dead, that soldier could have left traps around him. The enemy was known for hiding grenades, detonators, false maps, anything to delay the Americans. But it wasn't anything like that. Rocky growled low, not threateningly but urgently, as if to say, "That's it, watch this." Blake knelt beside the fallen officer. Dust clung to his trousers as he pushed a piece of concrete aside. When he finally saw what the enemy was holding, he was speechless for a few seconds. It was a small, heavy metal cylinder with engraved markings that didn't seem decorative. They looked like codes. They looked like identification for advanced military equipment. It looked like something that shouldn't be there, much less in the hands of a dead enemy in a ransacked house. "This is not ordinary equipment," Evans said, approaching. Blake opened his eyes, startled. "No, this is high-priority communication. Codes, maybe coordinates." Rocky gave a short bark, as if to confirm, "That's it, that's important." The tension of the moment was so great that no one immediately noticed the strangest detail. The enemy officer's left hand was pointed downwards, towards a small hole in the ground, as if he were trying to show something. Lewis highlighted the spot and held his breath. "Sir, there's more down here." The whole house seemed to breathe along with them. Blake gestured for them to dig. Evans and Lewis began removing pieces of rubble with extreme caution. With each stone moved, more dust rose, the wood creaked. But they continued. That's when they found it. An improvised compartment in the floor, camouflaged under broken planks. Inside, there was a package of documents inside a sturdy leather tube. Maps, lists, numbers, routes, schedules, all written hastily but very well organized. Blake picked up the package, opened it, and turned white. This wasn't just any paper. It was enemy attack plans detailed, targeted precisely where the American army believed it was safe. That discovery was absurd. Enemies hiding there, secret documents hastily abandoned, a dead officer trying to protect everything, or worse, trying to ensure that no one would find out. And in the midst of all this, Rocky, The dog that went in alone into a place where no soldier wanted to set foot. The dog that sniffed out the secret before everyone else. The dog, unknowingly, had just changed the course of that mission, and that was just the beginning. The atmosphere inside that ruined house was already bad, but it worsened when Blake realized they couldn't stay there much longer. The noise of the excavations, the creaking of the walls, the heavy breathing of the soldiers, all of that was enough to give away their position to any enemy patrol still in the vicinity. And in that overly silent village, any hidden enemy would be deadly. Besides, the roof seemed about to collapse at any second. A stronger gust of wind or a stray shot outside could bring everything down on top of them. The commander carefully tucked the documents into his vest. It was too much information to lose, but there was something beyond the papers that everyone was still processing. The metal cylinder the dead officer was holding. It didn't look like an ordinary object. It was heavy, cold, and had details that clearly didn't belong to standard equipment. It was as if the Germans had tried to hide something that even the rank-and-file soldiers didn't know existed. "Lewis, grab Rocky. Let's get out of here before this house completely collapses," Blake ordered. Lewis went to the dog, whose body was still tense and whose gaze was fixed on the hole in the ground, as if expecting something else to be found there. But when the soldier touched his neck, Rocky finally relaxed a little, as if he had accomplished an invisible mission. They began to retreat, with Blake in the lead, Evans covering the rear, and 3 other soldiers keeping their weapons pointed toward possible entrances. Each step was accompanied by the creaking of wood. Each breath seemed too loud. Every movement kicked up dust, blurring their vision. When they finally reached the exit, a gust of cold wind pushed the smoke into the house, creating a thick cloud that made the soldiers cough. But it was also this gust that revealed something no one had noticed before: fresh traces of boot prints going in and out of the house. Small, precise, recent footprints. Evans pointed it out. "Sir, we are not the only ones who have passed through here today." Blake frowned. "Footprints of recognition. This place isn't empty. They were here, or they still are." The silence that followed that sentence was heavier than any bomb. The soldiers exchanged glances, and Rocky, noticing the change in their demeanor, began sniffing again, restless. But before the commander could reorganize the group, a short, dry sound cut through the air. Tack. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a gunshot. It was wood giving way. And then everything happened too fast. The side wall of the house, weakened from the start, finally collapsed with a crash that raised a wave of dust and pushed the already fallen door several meters ahead. Soldiers instinctively threw themselves to the ground. Rocky barked loudly, frightened, and Lewis crouched down to protect him. Blake stood up coughing, brushing the dust off his uniform, but in the same second he froze. "Positions! Everyone ready!" he shouted. It wasn't just the collapse, it was the echo afterward. A strange, muffled echo that seemed to respond to the noise. A second later came the murmurs. Voices, whispers, hurried footsteps. They were enemies. They were close. Very close. The entire platoon turned, weapons raised, not knowing where the sounds were coming from. The soldiers' hearts were pounding so hard it seemed like everyone could hear it. It was that awful feeling that something was about to happen, but you still don't know where it's going to come from. Rocky then took 2 steps forward and barked once. That same warning bark, the bark that wasn't alarmist but decisive, the kind of bark that said, "Be careful, they're over there." And that's when the group saw it. Shadows moved through the cracks in the neighboring house. 3, maybe 4 silhouettes. Enemy soldiers observing the American movements from the beginning, perhaps waiting for the right moment to act. And now that the platoon had made too much noise, had found too much, the enemy decided it was time to intercept them. Evans's eyes widened. Damn, they knew we were here. Blake understood the gravity of the situation immediately. They couldn't go into combat there. Not with the roof collapsing. Not with sensitive information on them, and especially not with the number of enemies that could be hiding in the village. They needed to leave, and fast. "Move, quick, form a line, follow Rocky," Blake commanded. Rocky shot ahead. He seemed to know exactly where to go, as if he had an invisible map of the terrain in his head. He didn't run in a straight line. He made turns, dodged rubble, avoided areas where the walls were about to collapse. Lewis ran behind him, trying to keep up with his speed. The other soldiers followed close behind, maintaining formation. Then, when they arrived on the main street, the most unlikely moment happened. Rocky steam. He stopped abruptly, frozen. His eyes widened. He sniffed the air intently and stared at the ground as if he had found something else. Lewis almost fell while trying to brake. "Rocky, not now, kid. Let's go." But the dog didn't move. He tilted his head down and nudged something with his snout. Lewis looked, and her heart froze. It was the same symbol that was on the metal cylinder, etched into the concrete beneath pieces of wood and dust. A symbol burned into the ground, as if it had been hastily made with some hot tool. Evans murmured, "This is a marking route." They were coordinating everything from here. Blake stared at Rocky as if he were looking at the only person who understood what was really going on. The dog had found more than just documents. He had found the control point. The house wasn't just a hideout. It was the center of operations for an enemy group specializing in intercepting communications and organizing ambushes. And Rocky's suit, sensing this before any human could, was no coincidence. It was war instinct, pure instinct. And with enemies closing in from all sides, secret documents in his pocket, and a dog pointing him in the right direction, Blake realized the truth. That animal had not only found a secret, he had found the reason, because the war in that region was so hopeless. The fate of the platoon, and perhaps of hundreds of soldiers, had just changed. And it all started with Rocky's unexpected return. When the platoon finally managed to get away from the destroyed house, the feeling that they were carrying something much bigger than they had imagined began to become clear. They weren't just carrying documents in their backpacks and a mysterious metallic cylinder in their vests. They were carrying something the enemy tried to hide at all costs, something that cost the life of a German officer, and that now placed everyone there in an extremely delicate situation. The group stopped behind a half-collapsed wall, trying to catch their breath and reorganize their thoughts. Dust still hung in the air, swirling in the cold wind that blew through the deserted streets. The tension increased with each passing second because the shadows of the enemies they had seen before had not disappeared. They were approaching, silently, like predators, waiting for the right moment to strike. Blake knelt down, opened his vest and pulled out the metal cylinder. It looked like a piece of advanced equipment. It didn't look like a bomb or a radio. It was something different. There were symbols engraved on the side, deep markings, almost like tiny coordinates. Evans tried to bring the flashlight closer, but Blake held on tight. "Don't touch that without gloves. It could be a trap. It could be sensitive code," the commander said. Lewis watched Rocky sniffing the air restlessly. The dog was feverish, restless, as if he sensed that something very important was about to happen. Something that concerned not only the platoon, but the whole world, entire course of the war in that sector. Blake finally opened the side compartment of the cylinder. To everyone's surprise, there was a rolled-up piece of paper inside, a single piece of paper protected from being burned, torn, or wet. When the commander slowly unrolled it, everyone's expression changed. It was a map, but not just any map. It was an operational map, with marked routes, schedules, unit symbols, and arrows pointing to specific points in the region. Everything was very well calculated, organized, and ready to be executed. Evans' eyes widened. "Sir, this is an offensive, a major one." Blake had already read enough to understand the gravity of the situation. They planned to surround our units, everything, every platoon that's advancing through these hills. If this plan succeeds, nobody goes home. Lewis swallowed, hard, without taking his eyes off the map. "And this spot here," he pointed with a trembling finger, "this is exactly where we are." A heavy silence fell over everyone, a silence broken only by Rocky's short bark, as if confirming the obvious. They were in the center of a major enemy operation. They had narrowly escaped capture at that very moment. Blake put the map away again. "That explains everything," he said, taking a deep breath. "It explains why that house was so well protected. It explains the symbol on the floor. It explains the cylinder. That was their command post. And the dead officer was responsible for coordinating all of this." Evans shook his head, impressed. "But why leave it here? Why keep such an important plan in a destroyed house?" Blake thought for a few seconds, looking at the ruins as if he were going back in time. Someone tried to escape with it. Perhaps this officer was trying to hide or protect the documents when the bombing hit the village. Perhaps he was taken by surprise. Perhaps he was expecting reinforcements, but what matters now is that we found what they lost, and they already know it. Lewis took a deep breath, stroking Rocky's neck. If it weren't for him, we would have walked right past. We wouldn't have seen any of this. Evans laughed nervously. A dog just stopped an entire attack. If that's not wartime madness, I don't know what is. But the situation was far from funny. They held the most important information in the sector, and this only had two possible consequences. Either they handed it over to command and saved hundreds of lives, or they died right there trying. Blake knew what needed to be done. He stood up, pulled out his gun, and took a deep breath. They're going to come after this. They're not going to let this get away, not now, not after they've lost control. We need to get out of this village immediately, and we're not going back the same way. That's when Rocky did something unexpected. He barked. But this time it wasn't a warning or an alert. It was a call. And immediately after the bark, the dog started walking towards a narrow alley between two destroyed houses. Lewis tried to hold him back, but the commander raised his hand. Let go. If he's pulling us, it's for a reason. So far he hasn't made a mistake once. Rocky advanced decisively, sniffing every inch of wall, every inch of ground. His steps were quick, precise. He knew the terrain, or rather, he sensed what humans couldn't. The smell of enemy presence, the smell of fresh gunpowder, the smell of traps, the smell of a safe route. The platoon followed, one behind the other, forming a silent line. The alley was narrow and full of rubble, but it seemed much safer than the main street. Furthermore, the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, which meant the group's scent wouldn't reach the enemy directly. When they reached the end of the alley, Rocky stopped again. The dog looked at Blake as if waiting for permission. The commander approached and surveyed the surrounding area. It was a smaller area, but with several points of cover and no recent footprints. This path leads to the west side of the village, Evans said, checking the map. If we can get out that way, we'll reach the high hill. From there we can send a secure message to command. Blake nodded. So let's go this way. And stay alert. They won't give up easily. As they reorganized themselves, Lewis looked at Rocky and whispered, "Kid, do you realize what you just did?" Rocky simply stared at the soldier. He didn't need words. He knew, his instincts knew. And now, with documents and codes in hand and enemies after them, the platoon finally understood that none of this would have happened if the dog hadn't entered that destroyed house. And that, for Blake, was the crucial point. Rocky had not only found a secret, he had found the secret that could decide the future of the entire operation. They just needed to survive long enough to hand it over. The platoon had barely processed the weight of the discovery when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the village. It wasn't wind, it wasn't collapsing structures, it wasn't an animal running among the rubble. It was human footsteps, quick, coordinated, coming from more than one direction at once. It was the unmistakable sound of soldiers approaching. And they weren't Americans. Blake looked down the main street and saw what he feared most. Shadows moving among the wreckage. Silhouettes carrying rifles, tactical movement. They had been located. "They surrounded us," Evans murmured, pale. Rocky began to growl softly, focused in a specific direction. His fur stood on end, and the dog's entire body vibrated like a living danger detector. He could smell the approaching enemies, the scent of human sweat mixed with gunpowder. He knew the situation was going to get worse. And fast. Blake wasted no time. "Move now," he shouted. "If we stay here, we die. Follow Rocky. Lewis, take care of him. Evans, in the rear. Nobody stops." The pack took off as if on fire. Rocky led the way, weaving through the ruins with ease, dodging holes, jumping over sections of wall, always choosing the least exposed path. He didn't run on impulse. Every step was calculated. The dog had become the group's compass. The village was a labyrinth of destruction. Every alleyway looked the same. Every fallen house hid danger. And the enemies were closing in, appearing in places where none of the Americans expected them. A gunshot rang out. The bullet struck a wall inches from Blake's head, sending shrapnel flying everywhere. The commander instinctively ducked. "Contact!" shouted Evans, already turning to cover the area. Rocky barked loudly, a firm bark which made Lewis turn around immediately. "To the left!" Lewis shouted. "They're coming from the left!" And they really were. Two enemy soldiers emerged from the rubble, weapons raised. Evans fired first, forcing the Germans to retreat. The gunfire intensified. Bullets ricocheted off metal debris, struck destroyed walls, and kicked up dense clouds of dust that further obscured visibility. The platoon ran down a narrow street, guided by the dog, while shots flew across the air overhead. The adrenaline was so high that Lewis almost tripped when Rocky stopped abruptly in front of a fallen pile of wood. "What happened, kid?" he asked, breathless. Rocky sniffed the ground and took a step back, his ears lowered and his body rigid. Evans understood immediately. "Mina!" he shouted. The trail that seemed like the perfect path was completely overrun. If they had taken 3 more steps, the entire group would have been torn to pieces. Blake stared at Rocky with wide eyes. "He saved our lives again." But there was no time for thanks. The enemies were approaching. Shots were coming from 3 directions. The sound echoed between the destroyed houses like in a macabre speaker. The ground trembled slightly with each bullet. Impact. The platoon was becoming trapped. So Rocky took the initiative again. The dog turned sharply to the right and ran towards a narrow corridor between 2 destroyed houses. Lewis didn't hesitate. He found another route. "Let's go." The group squeezed into that narrow corridor. Sometimes it was so tight they had to squeeze sideways. Broken beams hung overhead, threatening to collapse at any moment. Dust fell like a fine rain, but it was the safest path, because Rocky had chosen it, and so far, he hadn't made a single mistake. When they reached the end of the corridor, a small clearing appeared among the ruins. From there they could see the hillside, the only place where they could try to re-establish communication with command. Evans looked up, trying to see the way. "If we climb that hill, might we have a chance?" Blake nodded. "Okay, let's go." But the enemy wasn't going to let it go easily. A shot hit the ground near Rocky, sending up a flurry of dirt and rocks. The dog jumped back, startled but didn't retreat. He knew he needed to keep going. Lewis crouched down beside him. "Calm down, kid. We're with you." Rocky responded with a short bark, the same bark he gave when he needed to move forward, even when scared. They started climbing the hill. The incline was steep, the ground was unstable. The ground slipped beneath their boots. Each step felt like carrying 100 kilos. But they had to climb, because up there was hope, up there was communication, up there was life. The enemies continued their pursuit, now more aggressive. Bullets tore through the air, shattering rocks, ripping chunks of earth. One shot passed within inches of Evans's backpack. "Keep going," Blake shouted. "Don't stop for a second." Rocky led the climb as if he had been born on that hill. He found small paths between the rocks, dodged holes, calculated every move. Lewis followed behind him, slipping, stumbling, but not giving up, because giving up meant dying. Halfway up the hill, Rocky stopped again. But it wasn't fear. It was a warning. He looked to his right, sniffed intently, and barked softly, as if saying, "This way." Blake understood. He found a shortcut. The group proceeded along the side of the hill, entering a more secluded area, with large rocks partially protecting them from enemy fire. When they finally reached the top, Evans fell to his knees, exhausted. Blake grabbed the radio, trying to turn it on with trembling hands. "This is Commander Blake. We have critical documents. I repeat, critical documents. We need immediate support. Static, more static. So finally," a voice. "This is forward command. We received it. Send coordinates." Lewis almost cried. Evans punched the ground in relief. More Rocky. Rocky was still on alert. He didn't relax, he didn't lie down, he didn't wag his tail. He was still staring at the village below, his ears pricked up and his body rigid, because he knew. The enemies had not given up. They were going up, coming from behind. The race against time was not over. She had just begun. The radio had finally worked, but the platoon knew very well that simply sending the coordinates didn't mean immediate salvation. Command needed to confirm everything, understand the contents of the documents, and mobilize a quick response, and that would take time. Time they didn't have. The hill was high, open, without sufficient cover, and the enemy was climbing hastily, determined to recover what the Americans had found. Blake watched the destroyed village below, analyzing every point where shadows moved. The Germans came like silent predators, scattered, approaching from different heights, trying to surround them again. They didn't just want to kill the platoon. They wanted to recover the documents. because if that reached the Allied command, the war in that region would change completely. Evans was breathing heavily, leaning against a rock, sweating profusely. "They're coming faster than I thought, sir." Blake squinted, calculating each route. "They know we're dealing with something important. If they didn't, they would have backed down already." Lewis crouched beside Rocky, who remained motionless, facing the advancing enemy. The dog trembled with energy, ready to react to any change. He could smell the wind rising from the village, and knew exactly where the enemy soldiers were before any human could even notice. "Stay with me, Rocky. We'll get through this," Lewis murmured, touching the dog's neck. Rocky didn't blink. He was 100% focused. Blake stood up. "They're going to try to climb the east slope first. It's the narrowest one. If we control it there, we'll gain time." Evans straightened up, raising his rifle. "So, let's hold that slope until command responds." And that's exactly where the chaos began. The first enemy emerged between two large rocks, climbing up quickly. He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Rocky barked so loudly it sounded like a siren. Blake instinctively turned, pulled the trigger, and hit the German before he could react. "Good one, Rocky!" Lewis shouted. But the enemy was not alone. Two more appeared right behind them, and then three more, each taking up position, firing towards the top of the hill. The bullets hit the rocks hard, sending shards of stone flying like shrapnel. Evans threw himself to the ground, covering Blake. "They're trying to surround us again. They're coming from both sides," Blake growled through his teeth, reloading his rifle. "We just need to hold it until the command responds, that's all." But just that seemed impossible. Lewis watched as Rocky jumped to the side of a rock and began to growl, staring towards the west path. "Rocky, what happened this time?" A second later, shots came from that direction. The dog had noticed before anyone else. "Watch out!" Lewis shouted, pulling Blake aside. The bullets passed exactly where the commander had been a second before, exploding earth and gravel. Rocky barked, ran forward, and dodged a rock guiding Lewis. "He wants us to cover that side," Lewis shouted. Blake nodded in approval, trusting the dog completely. Rocky ran to a spot where there was a large gap between the rocks, a perfect vantage point for a sniper. And he was right. An enemy soldier was there, adjusting his aim. Evans managed to hit him before he could fire. "That dog is a walking miracle," Evans shouted. But Rocky didn't stop. He ran to the right, then to the left, always anticipating his enemies. Each a vague. His barks was a direction, a warning, a command. He was also fighting, not with weapons, but with senses that no human possessed. The gunfire intensified, and the platoon's chances dwindled. Lewis glanced at Blake. "Sir, if they reach the top, it's over. We don't have enough cover." Blake knew this. The enemies were closing in very quickly. That's when the radio beeped. "This is forward command. We received your transmission. Were you able to verify the documents?" Blake pressed the button. "Confirmed. These are siege plans. To repeat, complete siege plans. If they execute this, we lose 3 companies in less than 24 hours. There was a heavy silence on the other end. Then, the answer. "Understood. Sending backup batteries. Hold on tight for 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 5 minutes in war was equivalent to an eternity in hell." Evans cursed under his breath. 5 minutes. "They'll be here in 2. Lewis looked at Rocky. The dog was panting, but still alert, still steady, still ready. "Blake," Lewis said, his voice trembling, "we're only alive this far because of him." Blake did not hesitate. "So let's do as he wishes. We'll follow Rocky. He's our eyes now." Rocky barked loudly at that moment, as if he had understood every word. The enemy advanced with full force. One group tried to advance up the east slope, but Blake and Evans held the line. Another group came up the west slope, but Rocky spotted them first, guiding the soldiers to better positions. But there was still more, much more. A large group, perhaps 10 or 12 enemies, appeared in the middle of the hill, advancing with mutual cover. They knew that time was running out for both sides. Bullets began flying from all directions. Dust rose, rocks exploded. The sun beat down on the smoke, creating a strange, almost suffocating glow. The air smelled of gunpowder and adrenaline. Lewis felt his heart beating so fast it felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. "Sir, they're almost at the top." Blake adjusted his aim. Evans threw the body to the ground and fired. Lewis held Rocky back to prevent him from advancing too far. Rocky wanted to protect. He wanted to fight. He wanted to stop the enemies from getting there. But then, it happened. A shot ricocheted off a rock, and hit the ground very close to Rocky. A large rock broke loose on impact and struck the dog in the flank. Rocky fell with a bark of pain. "Rocky!" Lewis shouted desperately. The world seemed to stop for a second. Lewis ran too, the dog gently pulling it away. "Stay with me, boy, stay with me. Don't close your eyes." Blake turned his face away for a moment. Evans swore loudly. Even the enemies seemed to hesitate, but Rocky didn't give up. Even injured, with his body trembling, he tried to get up. He growled. He pointed his snout again at the main slope. He was saying, "It doesn't end now. They're coming that way." Lewis was crying with anger and fear, clutching the dog's neck. "You're the bravest one here, Rocky. Stay. Strong." Blake pressed the radio button hard. "Command, we have a wounded man. We need backup now." On the other hand, a tense response. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. The enemies advanced. The platoon resisted. Rocky struggled to stay on his feet. And then, the sound everyone had been waiting for finally tore through the sky. The roar of Allied artillery. The batteries have arrived, and the war changed sides. The roar of Allied artillery ripped through the sky like thunder that had come to announce change. The first impact struck the lower slopes of the hill where the enemy had been advancing. The explosions raised waves of earth, dust and rock, throwing German soldiers aside and opening deep craters in the ground. The noise was so loud it made your chest vibrate from within, and the smoke spread quickly, creating a grey blanket that engulfed part of the village below. Blake took advantage of the immediate confusion to reorganize the peloton. "Everyone on the ground! Cover! Hold on!" Evans dove behind a large rock, dragging Lewis and Rocky with him. Lewis held the dog carefully, protecting its head from the flying debris. Even wounded, Rocky still tried to get up, still looking down, still growling at the enemies, as if he were willing to defend the hilltop until his last breath. The Allied artillery attack was surgical. The Germans tried to advance, but with each group that emerged, another explosion stopped them. The previously aggressive and coordinated movements began to turn into hurried retreats, desperate cries and confused orders echoing among the ruins. The advantage had changed hands, for the first time since the platoon arrived at that destroyed village. But Blake knew it wasn't time to celebrate. They were still on display, they still had critical documents, they still needed to get out of there alive. When the bombing subsided for a few moments, Blake crouched down beside Evans. "We need to get off the vantage point now. They'll try to counterattack when the smoke clears. We can't just stay here waiting for the end." Evans nodded. Lewis, his voice trembling and his hand shaking on Rocky's neck, murmured, "He's alive, but he needs help." Blake placed his hand on the soldier's shoulder. "Let's get him out of here. He's done more for us than anyone could ask. Now it's our turn to protect him." Rocky looked at Blake, and for a moment his eyes seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The dog took a deep breath, tried to stand up again and let out a small weak bark, not of pain but of insistence, as if to say, "Don't stop, keep going." Blake stood up, took a deep breath and shouted, "Prepare to retreat. Form a line." Lewis in front with Rocky, Evans in the rear. The group began descending the hill, using the smoke and holes formed by the explosions as cover. It was unstable terrain, full of loose rocks and craters, but still the safest route at that moment. Lewis carried Rocky in his arms, even though the weight was almost unbearable. The dog tried to help, straining his legs a little from time to time, but the wound on his flank left him weak. Every 10 meters, shots came from the direction of the village, enemies trying to hit anything that moved. But now the Americans had the advantage of altitude, smoke, and the disorganization caused by the Allied attack. The bullets passed through, but without accuracy. Still, each shot made the platoon's heart leap in its chest. When they reached the Somme, halfway point of the descent, a louder bang than the previous ones shook the ground. Blake looked back and saw an enemy group trying to advance. They were desperate. They wanted to recover the documents. They wanted to silence the platoon before they reached command. But then, another roar of artillery fell exactly where they were. The ground opened up, the smoke rose like a grey wall, and the enemy advance stopped. "Come on now!" Blake roared. The platoon ran through the last rows of stones until it finally reached the lowest part of the hill. There, hidden among burnt trees and mounds of loose earth, a group of Allied reinforcements awaited, alerted minutes earlier by radio. A sergeant rushed over when he saw the state of the group. "Are you Blake's squad?" "Yes," Blake shouted. "We have crucial information. We need to deliver it now." The sergeant signaled for the soldiers to make way. "Quick! The infirmary is ready! Bring the dog too!" Lewis, breathless, carrying the nearly unconscious Rocky in his arms, ran toward the makeshift medical post. Inside, 2 paramedics were already prepared with basic equipment to treat combat injuries. "Put him here," said one of the paramedics. Lewis laid Rocky down carefully, trembling, his face smeared with dust and tears. "Hold on, please, hold on." Rocky was breathing fast and shallowly. He was scared, but conscious. His eyes followed Lewis. Even there, on the makeshift stretcher, he was still trying to lift his head to see if the peloton was safe. The paramedic examined the wound. He was lucky. It was a hard blow, but it didn't penetrate. "He'll survive." Lewis fell to his knees. Evans patted him on the back in relief. Blake released the breath he had been holding for minutes. It was as if a weight of tons had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. While Rocky was being treated, Blake handed the metal cylinder and the document tube to the commanding officer. "Do you have any idea what you just saved?" the officer said, flipping through the maps with wide eyes. This here could have destroyed half a division. And you found this in a destroyed house?" Blake took a deep breath and replied, "It wasn't us. It was him." She pointed to Rocky, who was being carefully stitched up. The officer stared at the dog for a few seconds and shook his head in disbelief. So this animal just changed the course of the entire operation. Blake nodded without hesitation. "It's over. If it weren't for him, we'd all be dead." Lewis stroked Rocky's muzzle, who closed his eyes for a moment, finally relaxing after hours of tension. Evans approached. "This dog deserves a medal. Or 2. Blake gazed at the horizon, where smoke still rose from the destroyed village. "This dog deserves much more than a medal. He saved lives, he saved entire units. He changed the course of an attack. And all this because he followed an instinct that no human would have." The officer stared at the documents again. "The war will change because of this. Now we know where they are, what they're planning, and how they're going to move. You turned the tide today." Lewis smiled, tired and relieved, and looked at Rocky. "Did you hear that, kid? You turned the tables." Rocky opened his eyes, raised his tail, and gave a weak bark, as if answering, "I did my part." And he did. The story of that day spread through the Allied camps in the following weeks. Soldiers repeated the tale as if it were legend. The dog that entered a destroyed house and came out bringing a secret that saved everyone. It was not a myth, that was no exaggeration, that was true. And on that battlefield, surrounded by armed men, stunned officers, and the smell of burnt earth, Rocky, the dog who didn't hesitate when everyone else was afraid, became the hero no one expected. Did you ever imagine that a simple dog's instinct could change the course of an entire war? The lesson is clear. Sometimes, the difference between life and death lies in the courage of those we least expect. If this story has captivated you this far, leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel, and comment below. What city are you watching from? This helps a lot and motivates me to bring more stories like this.